We are going to be graphing waves today. We have two new equations, y equals a sine bx plus k and y equals a cosine bx plus k. So the first part of the equation down below is 3 sine x subtract 2. We are going to be finding the amplitude, which is a, which if you look up here, a is the very first number. So likewise, we are going to pull that down. The next portion we are going to be looking for is our vertical shift, which if you look in the original equation is going to be k. It's at the very end of the equation, which in our case will be 2. And then we will also be finding our period, which is 2 pi over b. It's not the same as the other two, like amplitude and vertical shift. You do have to calculate period. You can't pull it straight from the equation. So in our case, our b is going to be 1. So we're going to have 2 pi over 1, which will just be 2 pi. Let's continue with the second equation. We have our amplitude, which in this case is -2, but amplitude can never be negative, so we just put it as a positive e. Our vertical shift, which will be +1, and then our period, which is 2 pi over our b, which will be 2, which will give us a period of pi. Let's take that knowledge and pull it down to our first problem, which is 2 sine half x. We will be making a chart. We'll have our x, y, and our amplitude times y for our exact y. We will start at 0. Okay. So our a is going to be 2, because our first number is our a. Our amplitude is always a, but positive, which will stay the same as 2. Our period, which is 2 pi over b, will become 2 pi over 1/2, which will become 4 pi. And our vertical shift will be 0. Looking at the numbers we just found, our period will be our last number on our chart, and then we fill in the rest. To find our relative y, we will be using a chart. Right here, we will be looking at our y, so 0, 1, 0, and -1. And if you look, our sine starts on our x coordinate, while our cosine starts on our y. And it'll always flow in this direction. Because we have sine, we know that our first number will be 0, our second will be 1, our third will be 0, fourth -1, and then we repeat back to 0. We then take our y and we multiply it by our a. So 0 times 2 is 0, 1 times 2 is 2, 0 times 2 is 0, -1 times 2 is -2, and then 0 times 2 is 0. Graphing our points on the graph, we will first start by looking if we have a vertical shift. If we don't have one here at the end. So we're going to stay where our x and y axes are. Our first point we know is at 0, and our final is at 4 pi, because that is our period, how far we go. And then we can fill in our other 3 points in between the two. Our first point we know is 0. At x equals 0 will be y of 0. So we know that this is our first point. At pi, we're at 2. At 2 pi, we're at 0. At 3 pi, we are at -2. And at 4 pi, we are back at 0. And if you look, we have completed one period, which means that the other periods in front and behind it will repeat. So we know that the points behind it will continue this pattern. With this pattern, you can graph to the best of your ability. And you should get a graph that looks like this. Let's continue. Now we have a negative cosine to x plus 1. So let's make our chart. X, y, and our a times y. Starting at 0. Our a is negative 1, which means our amplitude is 1, because the amplitude is always positive. Our period, which is 2 pi over b, and our b is 2, so our period is pi, and our vertical shift is 1, because we have a plus 1 right here. Because our period is pi, we know that our final point will be pi. We can then fill out the rest of our x column. Looking back at our equation, we know that this is a cosine. And looking back at our chart, cosine starts at 1. So we know that our first point will be 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and repeating back to 1. We will then take our relative y and multiply it by our a. So 1 becomes negative 1, 0 becomes 0, negative 1 becomes 1, 0 remains 0, and 1 becomes negative 1. We can then plot our points on our graph. With these points, we have to remember that our vertical shift is plus 1. So our new line will actually be right here. Our first point at 0 is going to be negative 1, which will be right here compared to our new line. Our next point will be 1, 0, and negative 1. And because this completes our period, we can repeat it to the other side. And connect the dots accordingly. You should get a graph that looks like this. Let's continue on to our next problem. Our a is 2. Our amplitude will not exist only because amplitude is exclusive to sine and cosine. So with cosecant and down here secant, we can completely ignore the amplitude. Our period, which is 2 pi over b, will just be 2 pi, seeing as our b is 1. And then our vertical shift is negative 2. We can now create our chart. We know we're starting at 0. And we know that our period goes up to 2 pi. Okay. So finding our y, if we look back at our chart here, we can see that cosine and sine are the only 2 points we have. But what we do know is the reciprocal of sine and secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So what this means is that because we're starting with cosecant, we can look at our cosecant and see that it's the reciprocal of sine. So because sine starts at 0, which is technically 0 over 1, the reciprocal is 1 over 0, which is undefined. So then for any number that's at 0, for cosecant, it's undefined. So we know that our first number, because it does start at 0, because it's the reciprocal of sine, so it starts at the same point, will be undefined. At the next point, which is 1, which remains as 1, because 1 over 1 just flips. And then we're back at 0, which is undefined. Then we're at negative 1, which remains negative 1, and then back to undefined. We can now take our y and multiply it by our a. So for undefined, it remains undefined. For 1, we become 2. Undefined remains undefined. Negative 1 becomes negative 2. And undefined remains the same. We had a vertical shift of negative 2. our new line will be here. We can plot our points. Looking back at our chart, we can see that at 0, we're undefined, so we just put a dashed line for our undefined points. At pi over 2, we are at 2, which would be right here. At pi, we are at undefined, so we draw another dotted line. 3 pi over 2, we are at -2. And at 2 pi, we are at undefined. Now this pattern carries over to the other side of the graph. Our negative pi over 2 will not match our pi over 2 because if you remember, our starting point is at 0. So if we go backwards, we will hit -1. So our next point after undefined in the negative direction will be -1, which is why this is negative and this is in the positive. To graph these lines, because we do have an undefined line in between each point, we simply pull the lines up and out. And your graph should look like this. Let's go on to our next problem. Our A is 1 over 2. Our amplitude does not exist because it's exclusive to sine and cosine, and we are on a secant problem. Our period, which is 2 pi over b, seeing as our b is pi, will just be 2. And our vertical shift, seeing as we don't have one, will be 0. We can now plot our chart. Our period is 2, so we know that our endpoint will be 2, and we can fill in the points from there. Because we are doing a secant problem, over here you can see that the secant is a reciprocal of cosine, so we will start right at cosine right here. So our first number will be 1, and then 0 is technically 0 over 1. Finding the reciprocal gets you 1 over 0, which is undefined. Then we're at -1, which following the pattern would just be -1, then undefined, back at 0, and then back at 1. We can then fill out the bottom column by multiplying our y by our a. It's 1/2, undefined, -1/2, undefined, 1/2. We can also label our graph 1 over 2, -1 over 2, -1, -3 over 2, -2. Back at our chart, at 1/2, we are at undefined, so we can draw a dotted line. At 3 over 2, we are also at a undefined point, so another dotted line. That'll carry over to the negative side as well. At 0, we are at 1/2, so we can plot that point right there. At 1, we are at -1/2. And at 2, we are at 1/2. This pattern continues over into the negative side. And then if you remember from our cosecant problem above, we draw lines away and out. And your graph should look like this. I want you to try both problems below before I show you what I got. Take time and try this on your own. If you are ready for the answers, continue playing the video, and if you are not ready, pause the video now. The answers I got are as shown. If you have any questions, contact your teacher or rewatch the video.